Tonight we are going to talk about something so twisted that even fear itself would hesitate to name it out loud. A chemical born in sterile laboratories that escaped into the streets and turned entire cities into uncontrolled psychological battlefields. A substance that did not simply intoxicate bodies but disconnected minds from reality itself. Before we begin, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories, and write in the comments what city you're watching from and what time it is there. Because while you settle in to listen, we are about to descend into the origin of a molecule that was once praised as a medical miracle and later feared as a street legend. We will trace how a surgical anesthetic became angel dust, how operating rooms quietly transformed into psychiatric nightmares, how emergency rooms filled with people who felt no pain and saw no world, and how a misunderstood compound rewired fear, violence, and myth across an entire nation. This is the complete history of PCP, America's most misunderstood chemical monster. The story begins in 1956, inside the silent, polished halls of the Parke-Davis Laboratories, where the air smelled of solvents and ambition, and white-coated chemists moved between benches like priests in a temple of molecules. And there, without warning, without prophecy, a compound was assembled that no one in the room yet understood, a substance with the cold technical name phencyclidine, built atom by atom, not for chaos, not for madness, not for the streets, but for surgical perfection, for pain without suffering, for bodies that could be opened without screams, and at first it worked exactly as promised. Patients slipped into a floating stillness where breathing continued like a quiet metronome, muscles loosened, pain dissolved into nothing, and American medicine celebrated what looked like a miracle anesthetic, doctors praising its stability, its reliability, its elegant dissociation that kept the heart calm and the lungs obedient while the scalpel did its work. And in the clinical reports the word appeared again and again like a blessing, safe, effective, revolutionary. Yet behind the quiet rhythm of vital signs, something else was happening inside the minds of those drifting bodies. Something no stethoscope could hear and no chart could fully capture. Because when the operations ended and the lights brightened and voices called people back to consciousness, some patients did not return the same way they had left. Some woke confused, others terrified, others violently detached from the reality around them, staring at walls as if they were still falling through them, whispering about floating above the table, about voices that followed them out of unconsciousness, about worlds that refused to collapse back into a single room. And nurses began to exchange uneasy looks as restraints snapped and recovery rooms filled with sudden screams, and surgeons who had praised the drug now described awakenings that felt less like recovery and more like escape from somewhere dark. And slowly, quietly, behind the optimism and the promotional language, a question began to circulate through American hospitals like a nervous current under clean white floors. What exactly did we just create? Because the miracle was undeniable, the anesthesia flawless. But the mind that returned afterward sometimes came back fractured, sometimes returned angry, sometimes returned missing pieces of itself, as if the drug did not simply silence pain, but loosened the very brackets that held reality together. And in those first moments, long before the streets ever learned the name angel dust, long before sirens and headlines and fear, the shadow of PCP was already standing inside the operating room, invisible, patient, and waiting for its second life to begin. Soon the compound escaped the laboratory and entered the bloodstream of American medicine under a clean, reassuring trade name, Cernal, and hospitals across the country embraced it with the hunger of an industry, convinced it had finally tamed pain itself, operating rooms glowing with confidence as surgeons watched vital signs remain calm and obedient under the drug's influence, breathing steady, blood pressure unshaken, hearts beating like disciplined machines. And Parke-Davis spoke of a future where anesthesia would no longer flirt with danger, where patients could be opened without risk and closed without fear. And for a brief moment the promise felt real, because on the tables everything worked perfectly. Bodies stayed alive without resistance, muscles yielded without struggle, and the scalpel moved through flesh protected by chemical silence. But it was after the surgeries, in the place medicine preferred not to advertise, that the dream began to rot. Because the recovery rooms no longer behaved like recovery rooms, they became theatres of confusion and terror, where patients woke screaming as if falling through invisible holes, clawing at restraints with glassy eyes, crying that their bodies were not theirs, that they were trapped between worlds, that shadows were moving where no shadow should exist, and nurses filled their charts with notes that sounded less like medicine and more like exorcism. Violent agitation, severe hallucinations, panic without physical cause, sudden aggression in people who moments earlier had been calm. Hallway rumours grew louder with each shift change. Stories passed in whispers between staff who had never seen anything like this before, and slowly the admiration faded into unease as doctors realised they were not observing isolated reactions, but a pattern encoded deep inside the drug itself, and behind the confident brochures and polished advertisements a dangerous truth began to surface. Because Cernil did not simply remove pain, it broke the barrier that normally returns the mind safely back to the body, and as more patients crossed that line and struggled to return, the medical community began to ask a question that no company slogan could quiet. What if this substance was not imperfect? What if unpredictability was not a side effect at all, but its true nature? By 1965, the shine had worn off Cernil so completely that entire hospitals felt as if they were tiptoeing around a sleeping beast, afraid that any shift in routine might wake whatever lived inside that little vial, because the reports no longer came one at a time but in waves, psychotic breaks, violent emergence reactions, patients clawing at invisible shapes, patients waking in silence with eyes so empty they looked freshly carved out of their own reality. And Park Davis, once triumphant, now drowned under paperwork full of descriptions that sounded less like medicine and more like dispatches from a collapsing frontier. Nurses wrote that people returned wrong, that they drifted up from unconsciousness like drowned bodies rising to the surface, stiff, confused, detached, whispering that they could still hear things from the other side of anesthesia, while doctors stood at bedsides trying to coax minds back into their bodies, as if guiding lost travellers toward a door they could no longer see. And the FDA, no longer impressed by the earlier promises, demanded new investigations, new trials, new explanations that Park Davis could not provide. Because how do you explain a drug that behaved beautifully on the operating table, but tore the mind to shreds when the body began to wake? How do you defend a compound when respected surgeons describe patients as unable to re-enter reality, walking around in a haze so deep even their own names felt foreign? And soon the pressure became impossible to manage, the reports too grotesque to ignore, the testimonies too consistent to dismiss as rare complications. So Cernil was pulled from human use, quietly, almost shamefully, not with ceremony, but with the hush of an institution trying to bury its own optimism. Yet Park Davis, unwilling to surrender completely, made one last attempt at salvaging their invention by offering it to veterinarians, believing perhaps that the minds of animals might weather the dissociation better than humans, and for a moment the idea seemed promising, until the barns and clinics called back, with their own catalogue of horrors, horses that erupted into violent kicking fits the moment the drug began to fade, cats that froze mid-step as if locked in some impossible internal vision, dogs that stared at walls and howled at nothing, trembling as though they had glimpsed a world not meant for them, and soon even the veterinarians refused to touch the substance, their offices echoing with the same unease that had swept through hospitals only a few years earlier. And so, officially, phencyclidine died, a failed medical miracle swept into the archives of pharmaceutical regret, another chemical that had promised too much and delivered too strangely, its brief career ending not with applause but with exhausted resignation. Yet what no boardroom could anticipate, what no medical journal could predict, was that the story did not stop there. Because while the hospitals locked their cabinets and Park Davis shut down its research, the knowledge, the formulas, the synthesis, the whispers passed between chem students and lab assistants did not die at all. It simply slipped through cracks, moved quietly into garages and basements where curiosity replaced caution, where the boundaries of legality blurred, where people looked at this rejected molecule and saw not danger but opportunity. And somewhere in that transition from clinical failure to chemical orphan, PCP began its second life, unofficial, unregulated and far more catastrophic, reborn not as Cernil the anesthetic but as something far stranger, something the streets would name with grim poetry, a resurrection nobody asked for and nobody could control. When Park Davis finally turned its back on phencyclidine and sealed its medical career inside filing cabinets and forgotten drawers, the molecule itself did not disappear, because chemicals, unlike reputations, do not understand disgrace, and in the long quiet after Cernil's collapse, the remnants of its creation began to drift outward through invisible channels that no corporation could fully close, sliding through the hands of graduate students who had memorized the synthesis as an academic exercise, through technicians who had bottled its precursors without imagining their future, through researchers who tucked away notes the way people tuck away forbidden photographs, and in the bloodstream of the 1960s, an era humming with rebellion, curiosity, and the hunger to bend consciousness beyond its inherited limits. Those fragments found a new home, because the counterculture did not want anesthetics, it wanted keys, and PCP looked like a strange, powerful key glittering in the wreckage of abandoned science, exotic in name, radical in effect, and dangerously simple to rebuild for anyone with glassware, solvents, and enough nerve to test the result on themselves or others. At first, its movement was almost ceremonial and secret, traded in whispered circles that revolved around LSD, mescaline, and psilocybin, where it hid like a darker cousin nobody introduced openly, a substance passed not with flower-painted optimism, but with lowered voices and nervous laughter, and the earliest users approached it thinking it was simply another doorway into colour and meaning, another psychedelic ladder into the upper rooms of the mind. Yet the moment it took hold, the illusion shattered, because this was not a drug that painted reality with new shades. It reached underneath reality and loosened the bolts. It did not add visions so much as detach perception from the body entirely, and those who felt it first described not enlightenment, but separation, as if their muscles no longer belonged to their intentions, as if pain had been unplugged from the nervous system and replaced with a numb, hovering distance, as if the world had been shifted a few degrees out of alignment and could no longer be trusted to behave like a world at all. Very quickly, a new understanding spread among the early explorers. This substance did not imitate mushrooms, did not echo acid, did not guide like mescaline. It rewrote the rules of the body outright, making people walk without feeling impact, speak without hearing themselves, strike without registering resistance, and in some cases vanish inward so completely that they could not explain afterward where they'd gone, and suddenly the quiet chemistry of a rejected anesthetic became something else entirely, a street-born anomaly that did not promise insight but delivered disconnection, and because of that difference it attracted a different kind of curiosity, not the gentle seekers of altered consciousness, but those drawn to extremes, to the edge where sensation collapses into something colder and more dangerous, and as the drug passed from tiny apartments to back rooms, from student circles into darker networks of amateur chemists and underground distributors, its reputation mutated alongside its chemistry, because people no longer spoke of what it revealed but what it erased. Pain, fear, physical limits, the usual consequences that tell a human when to stop, and once that idea took root, the molecule could no longer remain contained, because a substance that turns off pain and fractures perception does not travel slowly. It spreads with the promise of invincibility whispered between strangers, and by the time anyone outside those early circles realized that phencyclidine had slipped fully into the wild, it had already shed its laboratory name, its medical history, and its last connection to intention, becoming instead an unnamed force moving quietly through a culture already primed for chemical rebellion. A drug the streets had not yet baptized but already feared, already misunderstood, already wrapped in stories that could not yet distinguish between exaggeration and warning. And somewhere in that shadowed transition, between the fall of a pharmaceutical dream and the birth of a street legend, PCP stopped belonging to science and began belonging to chance, chaos, and the coming mythology of a nation about to meet a monster it had unknowingly built with its own hands. By the late 1960s, while newspapers still argued about flower power and universities overflowed with slogans about freedom and expanded minds, an entirely different rebellion was quietly assembling itself in the shadows of California's suburbs, because in garages packed with stolen glassware, in basements that smelled of solvents and hot wires, independent chemists began rebuilding the rejected molecule with no oversight, no safeguards, and no patience for hesitation. Recipes passing hand to hand through university radicals like forbidden spells copied from chalkboards and lab manuals. Some of these operations disturbingly precise, with clean condensers and measured temperatures, others terrifyingly reckless with jars of ether stacked beside gas stoves. Cardboard boxes of reagents balanced next to extension cords sparking against concrete, places where one wrong movement could have erased an entire block in a flash of fire. and the earliest batches that emerged from those improvised laboratories were raw and unstable, concentrations wildly uneven, impurities swimming invisibly inside the liquid, and the people who sampled them became unwilling test subjects in a chemical experiment that no ethics board would ever approve. Overdoses climbing almost immediately, not because users chased excess, but because the product itself could not decide what it was. One drop barely noticeable, the next tearing the mind loose from its hinges, and as these volatile brews moved outward through small networks of dealers and bikers and party circuits, Los Angeles began to absorb the shock first, the city becoming the initial proving ground where PCP learned how the streets would shape it, and how it would reshape the streets in return. Emergency rooms started receiving patients who could not explain what had happened because language had temporarily abandoned them, bodies arriving that showed almost no response to pain, while their minds scattered into frantic, dissociated fragments. And still, the media saw nothing yet. No narrative, no headline monster to chase. Only a handful of unexplained hospital reports buried beneath stories of protests and music festivals and political assassinations, because the city had not yet realized that something far more destabilizing than any ideology was quietly being distilled beneath its own neighborhoods. And in those early months, no one spoke of angel dust. No one warned of superhuman rage. No one imagined how police departments would someday rewrite training manuals around this molecule. All that existed was a liquid passed inside tiny vials and soaked into leaves and cigarettes, producing reactions so alien that even seasoned users struggled to describe them afterward. People walking through traffic without acknowledgement, others laughing in corners at visions nobody else could see, some collapsing into stillness so deep onlookers feared they had died while their hearts continued beating calmly beneath motionless ribs. And each new episode fed the underground legend faster than any advertisement ever could, because a drug that erased pain and scrambled perception did not require marketing. It required only witnesses, and Los Angeles provided them in abundance. Witnesses who carried stories into clubs, into biker bars, into student housing, into anywhere a rumor could outrun a warning. And still the nation slept on the edge of the wave, unaware that what had begun as a few rebellious chemists cooking in isolation was rapidly arranging itself into a full-scale street phenomenon. One that thrived precisely because it made no sense, because it did not promise warmth or love or insight, but something colder and more dangerous. The temporary suspension of limits themselves, and by the time the wider world began to notice, by the time cameras and commentators tried to understand what was happening inside California's shadow laboratories, PCP had already finished its apprenticeship in chaos and was preparing to introduce itself to the rest of the country without explanation, without apology, and without any intention of being controlled. The moment the molecule reached the hands of street dealers, its cold laboratory name vanished almost instantly, because phencyclidine sounded like a prescription, and the streets needed a myth, something light enough to invite curiosity and dark enough to promise escape, and so it was baptized Angel Dust, a name that sold weightlessness, detachment, flight, the fantasy that the mind could simply lift itself out of the body and drift free of gravity. And at first the stories followed that illusion with eerie consistency. Early users whispering about floating above their own shoulders, about watching themselves walk as if operating a borrowed body, about passing through walls that dissolved like smoke, about colours that did not exist in daylight but burned behind closed eyes like forbidden suns. And those first testimonies travelled fast because they sounded like transcendence without effort, an out-of-body experience bottled and sold by the drop. Yet almost immediately a second current of stories began moving alongside the first, quieter at first, then impossible to ignore, because not everyone returned from those flights intact. Some came back shaking, eyes pinned wide with fear that did not fade. Others collapsed into seizures that twisted their bodies into shapes no witness could forget. And still others erupted in sudden violence without memory of what had driven their hands. And as these darker reactions multiplied, the newspapers finally caught the scent of something they could not romanticize, printing the first alarmed headlines about a dust that appeared to switch human behavior without warning, a chemical that did not simply intoxicate but destabilized identity itself. And another name rose out of police chatter and street slang, hog, a word that stripped away the angelic fantasy and replaced it with something heavier and more animal, a nickname that hinted at raw, uncontrolled strength and a frightening indifference to impact. Yet even this did not capture the truth of what the drug was actually doing, Because PCP was not creating monsters, it was removing the internal brakes that normally tell a person where the edge lies, and into that absence rushed panic, confusion, aggression, and hallucination in unpredictable combinations. And still the mythology kept growing faster than the medical understanding. Stories exaggerating into legends of impossible endurance and inhuman power, while the reality unfolding in hospital corridors was far messier and far more tragic. People arriving with shattered bones they had not felt break, with burns they did not notice forming, with memories missing entire hours or days as if erased by an unseen blade, and as journalists hunted for spectacle and police hunted for explanations, the myth of angel dust hardened into something the public could point at, fear and misunderstand, a name that shimmered with false promise on one side and pure dread on the other, while the drug itself remained indifferent to both, continuing to do what it had always done since the operating room: detach sensation from consequence, separate perception from the body, and leave behind a human being struggling to explain a storm that had no language. And in that widening gap between legend and lived experience, between the fantasy of angels and the reality of shattered minds, PCP secured its most enduring weapon, because once a drug becomes a story before it is understood, every new victim becomes not a warning, but another chapter in a mythology that keeps growing, whether the truth can keep up or not. Between 1972 and 1978, while politicians congratulated themselves on fighting one drug epidemic after another, and television pumped out images of a changing America, something far quieter and far more volatile was spreading through the country like a chemical rumour, because in those years angel dust stopped being an obscure experiment whispered about in select circles, and became, almost overnight, the fastest moving street drug in the United States, its speed not powered by marketing campaigns or glamorous dealers, but by three brutal advantages. It was cheap, it was absurdly easy to manufacture once you knew the recipe, and it was potent enough that a few careless drops could turn a casual encounter into a full psychotic episode. And dealers, always efficient when profit meets obliviousness, began to adapt the product to the streets with a kind of ruthless creativity, no longer selling vials or powders, but dipping ordinary things, mint leaves, parsley, marijuana joints, ordinary tobacco cigarettes, into liquid PCP and letting them dry into unassuming little torches of dissociation, then passing them across neighbourhoods under new names that sounded almost harmless, almost playful: Sherm, Fry, Water, nicknames that hid the pharmaceutical ghost tucked inside each soaked fibre, and people bought them precisely because they did not look like much, because they did not require syringes or special equipment, or even a new ritual, just a cigarette, a match, and the willingness to inhale something you did not fully understand. At first, the high fascinated those who tried it, that cold, uncanny feeling of sliding out of the body and watching the world from a strange tilted angle, footsteps echoing as if they belonged to someone else, time thickening into syrup, sound arriving late, pain fading into a distant technical detail, and word of this new float travelled through parties, housing projects, alleyway economies and after-hours clubs until entire neighbourhoods knew someone who had smoked water and gone out there for a while. But as always with PCP, fascination walked arm in arm with disaster, and it was the emergency rooms that saw the true shape first, the fluorescent corridors of urban hospitals filling with people who were not drunk, not high in any familiar way, but utterly cut loose from the ordinary rules of being a body. Patients brought in screaming that their limbs were plastic, that their hearts had stopped even while monitors showed normal rhythms, others lying eerily still with eyes wide open, unblinking, as if trapped somewhere they could not describe, some ripping out IV lines without flinching, blood dripping unnoticed as they kept talking to hallucinations only they could see, and doctors who had already survived earlier drug waves realized they were now dealing with something different, a substance that seemed designed not to soften reality, but to unhook it from the flesh altogether. Meanwhile, police departments across the country began logging incident reports that read like scenes from a horror film, but were painfully, stubbornly real. Officers called to deal with individuals wandering in traffic, oblivious to honking cars, people walking barefoot across broken glass without reacting, suspects who did not drop when hit with batons or tasers, who seemed to register pain only as a vague suggestion, not a command to stop, and when officers tried to restrain them, the encounters often turned into chaotic struggles, in which a single dissociated person fought off multiple trained adults, not because they were superhuman, but because the normal feedback loop of pain and fear, those invisible brakes that make most humans surrender, had been chemically disconnected, and every such event, every bloody arrest, every shattered window and overturned police cruiser fed the growing appetite of local and national media, which began weaving all these fragments into a single, monstrous narrative that fit neatly into headlines and terrified audiences. PCP turns people into monsters. PCP gives ordinary citizens the strength of machines. PCP makes them immune to pain, to reason, to bullets. And though much of this was exaggeration layered over misunderstanding, the images were powerful and unforgettable. Grainy footage of people restrained by 5 officers, blurry mugshots framed by words like rampage and frenzy, anonymous ER staff describing patients possessed by something that would not let them rest. And so angel dust, the orphaned anesthetic, became in the public mind not just another drug but a transformation device, a chemical switch that could flip a human into something other. And in that feverish atmosphere of fear, rumour and half-understood science, few stopped to ask the more disturbing question hidden underneath the hysteria. If a substance can erase pain, fog identity, blur memory and scramble perception this thoroughly, what exactly are we looking at when we stare into the eyes of someone under its control, a villain, a victim, or a brain suddenly operating without the boundaries we take for granted? And what does it say about the society that lets such a molecule slip out of its laboratories and into its alleys without truly understanding the storm it carried inside? Between flashing sirens and trembling camera footage, the 80s did not invent the panic around angel dust, but they perfected it. Because once the first dramatic encounters reached television screens, the nation discovered a new kind of fear that fit perfectly between commercial breaks, and newspapers learned very quickly that nothing sold faster than a chemical monster with a human face. So every arrest became a spectacle, every hospital restraint a headline, and every chaotic struggle between police and a dissociated suspect was edited into proof that PCP had unlocked something in the human body that should never have been touched, and the phrase superhuman strength erupted across front pages and evening reports as if it were an established medical fact rather than a desperate metaphor. Anchors speaking with grave certainty about men who could not be subdued, about suspects who shrugged off pain as if bones were optional, about bodies that refused to obey the rules of damage. And soon the exaggerations grew bold enough to abandon restraint altogether. Rumours of bulletproof rages, of people impervious to tasers and batons, of cannibalistic impulses attributed not to famine or psychosis, but to a single molecule that now seemed to be credited with every nightmare the culture could imagine. And in apartment living rooms across America, families watched these images with the same frozen attention once reserved for natural disasters, convinced that a once hidden drug had become a roaming contagion capable of transforming ordinary neighbours into unstoppable threats without warning. And yet behind the spectacle, inside laboratories and journals that rarely reach the evening news, scientists were quietly dismantling nearly every claim being broadcast with such confidence, explaining that PCP did not grant strength, that it did not fortify muscle fibres or thicken bones, that it did not wrap the nervous system in armour, but instead did something far colder and far more dangerous. It silenced the internal signals of inhibition and fear, disconnected the body's alarms, removed the logic that tells the mind when to stop, and in that absence of brakes, people did not become stronger. They simply stopped protecting themselves, fighting not with superpower, but with recklessness so absolute it looked like invincibility to anyone watching from the outside, and the apparent immunity to pain was not a shield but a blindfold, a failure to register damage until the damage was already catastrophic. But these explanations travelled too slowly and sounded too technical to compete with the burning simplicity of the monster narrative, and the media, now addicted to its own creation, stopped distinguishing between verified incidents and rumour, between documented effects and street mythology, because fear did not require footnotes, and so fabricated stories slipped effortlessly alongside real tragedies. Police reports reshaped into legends, whispered jailhouse tales inflated into national warnings, until the public consciousness itself became a laboratory where exaggeration metastasized into belief, and once that belief hardened, it no longer mattered what the science said, because the myth had achieved escape velocity, shaping how officers approached suspects, how judges viewed defendants, how hospitals prepared for incoming patients, how entire neighbourhoods were policed as if angel dust itself might leap out of shadowed doorways at any moment. And the tragedy buried inside this distortion was that the people under PCP's influence, confused, dissociated, frightened, often injured without realising it, were no longer seen as patients or even as citizens in crisis, but as embodiments of a story already written for them before they spoke a word. And in that shift from medical reality to cultural nightmare, the true danger of propaganda revealed itself, because it did not merely misinform, it rewired perception, turning a complex neurochemical effect into a symbol of inhuman threat, creating a monster that lived not just in headlines, but in policy, in training manuals, in courtroom rhetoric, and long after many cities would see the actual drug fade from prominence. The legend of the superhuman PCP fiend would continue to haunt collective memory, impossible to kill, because myths born from fear rarely require evidence to survive, only repetition, and repetition was exactly what the age of broadcast hysteria provided in unlimited supply. By the time law enforcement realised that angel dust was no longer a fringe disturbance, but a full-fledged nationwide crisis, the response arrived not in the language of medicine or caution, but in the blunt vocabulary of force, because officers across the country were encountering something they had never trained for. Individuals who did not register pain, who did not slow when struck, who did not respond to verbal commands or physical restraint. Men and women who seemed to move through arrests like sleepwalkers trapped inside storms only they could see, and the reports coming back to precincts read like dispatches from an entirely new battlefield. Suspects walking barefoot across glass without flinching. Suspects breaking out of zip ties and metal cuffs as if they were cheap wire. Suspects stepping into traffic with serene indifference. Suspects fighting 3, 4, sometimes 5 officers at once with blank, dissociated faces that frightened officers more than the violence itself. And one phrase began circulating among exhausted patrolmen and shaken rookies alike. Fighting a ghost inside a confused human body, a line that captured the impossible contradiction of dealing with someone whose mind had gone somewhere unreachable, while their body continued to thrash with terrifying endurance. Departments, unprepared for this kind of chaos, scrambled to rewrite their training manuals, adding new chapters on excited delirium, new guidelines on restraint techniques, new warnings about the dangers of chasing someone who could run full speed with a broken ankle and never notice it. And alongside these internal changes, the political machine roared to life with predictable fury. Senators thundering about chemical threats in America's streets, governors vowing to eradicate angel dust mania, and Congress, eager for an easy villain, moved swiftly to classify PCP first as a Schedule II substance, dangerous yet with hypothetical medical potential, before doubling back almost immediately and pushing for Schedule I, stripping it of all legitimacy and branding it as one of the most dangerous compounds in circulation, a legal death certificate that did nothing to slow the real engine behind the crisis, money. Because while lawmakers made speeches and precincts rewrote protocols, the underground chemists who had birthed the initial wave of PCP production were quietly multiplying, copying recipes onto napkins, notebooks, and stolen lab forms, passing knowledge across cities like a contagion, and every new raid seemed only to confirm what officers whispered among themselves, that for every lab shut down, 2 more emerged, tucked behind warehouse doors, hidden in suburban garages, perched above auto shops and convenience stores, their shelves lined with jars of ether and reagent bottles that could ignite an entire block if handled poorly. Yet the danger did not deter them, because PCP was absurdly profitable, one of the few drugs where a small batch could yield immense earnings, dipping leaves and cigarettes into liquid that cost pennies to produce and selling them for a fortune in alleys, clubs and housing projects. Arrests, rather than collapsing the market, only thinned out the least careful players, leaving room for more ambitious chemists to step in, refine their product, expand distribution routes, and perfect evasion tactics, and law enforcement found itself trapped in a paradox. Attacking the supply made the drug more valuable, which in turn created more suppliers. Cracking down on sellers pushed distribution deeper underground, where encounters became even more dangerous. Escalating force produced more dramatic incidents, which fed the media panic, which justified harsher police responses, which fed the legend, which increased demand among the thrill-seekers drawn more to myth than to chemistry, until the entire system resembled a wheel spinning faster every year, fueled not by rational strategy, but by fear, adrenaline, profit, and a profound misunderstanding of what the drug actually did to the human brain. And in that widening gap between policing and pathology, between political theatre and chemical reality, PCP continued to circulate freely, a rejected anesthetic turned street wildfire, thriving precisely because every attempt to crush it only added more oxygen to the flames. By the time PCP fully severed its last ties to legitimate medicine, it did not simply survive underground, it evolved there, becoming the first dissociative drug in American history to be widely manufactured outside of any industrial framework, no corporate safety protocols, no regulatory oversight, no emergency shutdown systems, just knowledge, nerve, and a scattered network of amateur chemists who treated forbidden chemistry like a private religion. And across the West Coast, the recipes began to move faster than the law could track them, copied from stolen academic notes, whispered between students who had once worn lab coats for grades and now wore them for profit, passed between bikers, dealers, and self-taught tinkerers who had learned just enough chemistry to be dangerous. And because PCP did not require elaborate pharmaceutical infrastructure, it invited a new kind of producer into the drug economy. The garage chemist, the basement technician, the teenager with a catalogue and a fantasy of control over molecules that could rewrite the human nervous system. And chemical suppliers, unaware or pretending not to notice, began shipping alarming quantities of precursors to shell companies with clean-sounding names and non-existent business histories, boxes arriving at abandoned storefronts, rented storage units, suburban homes with drawn curtains, and even high school lockers, while mail-order catalogues quietly delivered glassware, condensers, flasks, burners, and tubing to anyone with enough cash and a mailing address, turning kitchen counters and tool sheds into unstable laboratories balanced on the edge of catastrophe. And inside these spaces, the chemistry itself began to mutate, because once a molecule escapes into amateur hands, it stops being singular, and soon chemists started modifying structures, altering chains, tweaking bonds not out of scientific curiosity, but survival and competition, experimenting blindly with analogues that mimicked PCP's dissociative core while slipping past laws that outlawed only specific arrangements of atoms, creating dozens of chemical cousins, some weaker, some disturbingly stronger, some so unpredictable that even the people making them could not estimate what a single drop might do to a human being. And the cost of this blind innovation was written not only in hospital admissions, but in fire reports and hazmat call-outs. Because these laboratories were not merely illegal, they were unstable by their nature, jars of ether stacked beside faulty wiring, pressurized vessels heated without safeguards, volatile solvents evaporating into closed rooms thick with cigarette smoke, and across California and beyond, emergency responders began rushing to scenes that looked less like crime busts and more like industrial disasters compressed into single-family homes, walls blown outward, roofs torn open, neighbours evacuated as teams in protective suits dismantled what remained of improvised chemical factories, often discovering half-finished batches still bubbling on shattered stoves. And in the aftermath, the same pattern repeated again and again, one lab gone, two more quietly assembling somewhere else. Because the chemistry underground no longer depended on centralised knowledge, it functioned like a decentralised nervous system, each amateur chemist, both student and teacher, learning through rumour, catastrophe, and improvisation, while the drug itself continued flowing outward through cities as if production were merely a background process too distributed to destroy. And what terrified authorities most was not just the volume of PCP being produced, but the unpredictability of what it had become, because unlike heroin or cocaine, which emerged from relatively stable biological sources, PCP now existed as a shifting family of compounds cooked by people who did not fully understand the forces they were unleashing, meaning no two batches were ever truly the same, no two reactions identical, and every hit on the street carried not only the risk of dissociation, psychosis, and injury, but the added gamble that the chemistry itself might be something nobody had ever tested before, turning users into participants in an uncontrolled nationwide experiment conducted not by scientists but by desperation, ambition, and the intoxicating belief that if you could assemble the molecule yourself, then maybe, just maybe, you could control it. A belief that would prove as catastrophic as the fires that kept illuminating the secret world of PCP production in brief, violent flashes across the American night. By the late 70s, as the psychedelic haze of the West Coast drifted into bitterness, and the underground labs kept flooding California with their volatile brews, angel dust began migrating eastward like a chemical storm front, carried not by weather, but by dealers, veterans, drifters, musicians, and the restless pulse of American city life. And when it finally reached New York, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C., it did not arrive quietly. It fused itself into the existing street culture with a kind of predatory ease, slipping into neighborhoods already strained by poverty, police tension, and the collapse of urban infrastructure, becoming not just another vice but a ritual, a challenge, a dare whispered through stairwells and alleyways. And among these cities it was DC that embraced the drug most explosively, transforming within a few short years from a political capital into the unofficial capital of PCP, where entire blocks would fill with the ghostly smell of Love Boat. The deceptively innocent name given to tobacco cigarettes dipped into liquid PCP until the paper turned a faint chemical sheen, then left to dry like wicked little souvenirs of a molecule that had already wreaked havoc across the country. And at dusk, young men in tank tops and rolled-up sleeves would gather on stoops or beneath fluorescent streetlights, passing around these doctored cigarettes with the casual confidence of people unaware that they were about to leave their bodies behind and crash into a reality that no one, not police, not doctors, not even experienced users, could predict. On some nights, the entire atmosphere of a neighborhood would shift, becoming charged with the strange, dangerous energy of people who had taken a drug that did not slow them down or soften their edges but peeled away the very sensations that tether humans to caution. Crime began to spike not because users sought violence, but because they no longer recognized risk, danger, or even themselves, smashing storefront windows with empty expressions, wandering into gang territories without understanding the consequences, sprinting into traffic with the calm indifference of someone stepping into a warm bath, and the open-air drug markets that once dealt primarily in heroin and cocaine now buzzed with the new commerce of angel dust, dealers dipping cigarettes on folding tables, buyers clustered like moths around flames they couldn't see. In emergency rooms across DC and New York, the staff, already exhausted from years of handling overdoses and withdrawals, found themselves confronting a new species of crisis, bodies arriving with injuries that made no sense, arms broken clean through yet held as casually as umbrellas, feet sliced open from running barefoot across glass and pavement, deep burns from lingering too long on hot metal surfaces, jumpers who climbed out windows under the hallucination that gravity no longer applied to them, and perhaps the most unsettling cases of all, the ones who ran headfirst into walls with such force that police assumed they were attempting suicide, only to discover that the victim reported no intention, no emotion, often no memory of it happening at all, as if their bodies had acted on impulses divorced from logic, sensation, or pain. Doctors, nurses, and paramedics soon developed a unique dread reserved specifically for PCP nights, because each call could escalate into a spectacle of unpredictable physics. A man who sat motionless and catatonic for minutes before exploding into sprinting violence, a woman who refused sedation because she could not understand why her muscles weren't responding the way she remembered, a teenager who spoke to invisible figures with serene certainty as his heart rate spiked dangerously toward collapse. And through these cases, the hospital became not a place of healing, but a containment zone for people temporarily separated from reality, their minds floating somewhere above their bodies while the staff worked frantically to prevent permanent injury. Police departments on the East Coast found themselves equally overwhelmed, reporting encounters that echoed the chaotic scenes from Los Angeles, but amplified by the dense architecture of East Coast cities, narrow row-house hallways turning arrests into wrestling matches, apartment complexes creating echo chambers of screams and confusion, and stairwells becoming vertical gauntlets where officers sometimes had to chase dazed individuals who climbed upward in complete silence before throwing themselves off the landing under the hallucination that they could glide. In precinct meeting rooms, commanders underlined new warnings about this superhuman dust, repeating myths and half-truths now fully absorbed into law enforcement culture, that PCP users felt no fear, no pain, no remorse, that they could break through doors, shrug off handcuffs, and overpower entire squads, and while many of these claims were exaggerations, they shaped police tactics dramatically, leading to heavier use of force, more backup requests, and a deepening of the adversarial relationship between officers and the communities, now saturated with PCP's influence. New York tabloids, always hungry for spectacle, began running headlines that made PCP sound less like a drug and more like a possession. The zombie dust, the madness cigarette, the rage chemical, and these stories, printed in sharp fonts beside grainy photos of glassy-eyed suspects restrained on stretchers, spread across barbershops, subway benches, and nightly dinner tables until the public accepted them as fact. In Baltimore, ministers preached sermons about a new devil entering the city, a devil that did not need demons or rituals, just one cigarette dipped in a liquid that turned neighborhoods into unpredictable battlegrounds. By 1978, news anchors spoke of PCP not as a regional phenomenon, but as a national horror, the kind of threat that could appear in any city, any schoolyard, any apartment party, turning a normal night into a headline. What none of these outlets recognized, what none of them even tried to understand, was that PCP's spread across the East Coast was not simply a drug trend, but the result of a perfect storm: economic decline, lack of mental health resources, collapsing city budgets, and a psychological wound running through communities already navigating violence, addiction, and social neglect. Angel dust did not create these conditions. It exploited them, and as emergency rooms filled, as police reports stacked higher, as television screens flickered with dramatic warnings, one truth became impossible to deny. PCP was no longer a chemical oddity, no longer a West Coast anomaly, no longer an underground experiment. It was now a national story, a nationwide crisis, and a symbol of how deeply a single forgotten molecule could penetrate the cracks of an entire country. By the time scientists finally turned their full attention back to PCP, no longer as a failed anesthetic or a street legend, but as a neurological weapon, they discovered that the molecule's true violence did not unfold in muscles or bones, but in the deepest relay centers of the human brain. Because phencyclidine does not stimulate like cocaine or sedate like heroin, it sabotages communication itself, sliding into the nervous system as an NMDA receptor antagonist, quietly blocking one of the most fundamental signal pathways neurons use to speak to one another. And when that bridge goes dark, the brain does not simply slow down or speed up. It fractures. Perception disconnects from sensation, memory loses its threads, and consciousness floats unanchored between competing versions of reality, which is why under PCP the body can move without ownership. Pain can exist without recognition, and fear can vanish without courage ever replacing it. In laboratories, this mechanism looks like abstract chemistry, a diagram of receptors opening and closing. But in the living subject, it becomes dissociation so profound that people describe watching their own hands move as if they belong to a stranger. Amnesia so thick that entire hours collapse into blank silence. Anesthesia so complete that shattered bones register as distant pressure at most, and hallucinations that do not bloom with colour like classic psychedelics, but intrude like errors in the operating system of reality itself. Voices that arrive with no source, shadows that move without bodies, rooms that seem to tilt and breathe as if the laws governing space have become optional. What horrified researchers most was not just what PCP did in the moment, but what it seemed to leave behind once the acute effects faded, because long-term users began presenting with symptoms that looked disturbingly familiar to psychiatrists. Persistent paranoia, emotional flattening, fragmented thinking, flashbacks that erupted without warning days or even weeks after use, and cognitive decay so subtle at first that families mistook it for stress or exhaustion, before realizing that something far deeper had shifted, something structural, something that did not want to heal. In controlled studies, scientists began administering PCP to animal models and observing behaviors that mirrored human psychosis with unsettling fidelity. Disorganized movement, exaggerated startle responses, social withdrawal, and erratic bursts of aggression, followed by long periods of vacant stillness. And the parallels grew too strong to ignore, because the very same neural pathway PCP disrupted was already suspected to be involved in schizophrenia itself, turning the drug into an accidental key that unlocked a living simulation of one of the most devastating mental disorders known to medicine. In research papers, the language stayed clinical: glutamate transmission, cortical disinhibition, thalamocortical dysregulation. But behind those sterile phrases lurked a terrifying implication. PCP does not merely alter mood or perception, it loosens the fundamental scaffolding that allows consciousness to remain coherent from second to second. It introduces static into the signal that tells the brain what belongs together and what does not. And in that static, reality begins to misalign. Thoughts no longer sequence properly, emotions detach from context, and actions erupt without the quiet negotiations that normally precede them. This is why users report feeling as though they are split into observer and actor, why memory records events with missing frames, why some describe returning from a PCP episode as if waking from a life that was not theirs, carrying fragments of another identity they cannot fully discard. What makes this break especially cruel is that unlike many substances that wash out of the system with time, PCP's influence on the brain may linger invisibly, reshaping circuits through repeated exposure, training neurons to operate under distorted conditions until paranoia becomes default, suspicion becomes reflex, and emotional responses flatten into a dull, distant echo of what they once were. Researchers would later describe former users who no longer trusted the continuity of their own thoughts, who lived with a permanent sense that something unseen was watching them, that voices hovered just beyond hearing, that reality itself remained slightly unzipped along its seams. And in this long-term shadow, the comparison to schizophrenia ceased to be metaphorical and became tragically precise, because PCP did not just imitate psychosis for a few hours, it could carve the conditions for it into neural architecture. In this way, the molecule that had once promised painless surgery revealed its darkest truth. It did not merely silence pain, it destabilized the very mechanism by which the brain defines what pain, body, memory, and self even are. One small chemical structure, assembled decades earlier under clean fluorescent lights, now stood exposed as a solvent not just of sensation but of coherence itself, capable of turning the unified experience of being human into a broken transmission filled with ghosts of sensation, echoes of fear, and gaps where identity used to reside. And in the cold language of neuroscience stripped of myth and hysteria, the verdict was more chilling than any headline ever printed. PCP did not create monsters, it created disconnects, and in the space where connection broke, the mind learned how easily reality could be made to fall apart. By the time angel dust had fully embedded itself into the national imagination, there was no longer any clean line between documented reality and the fevered folklore that surrounded it, because a series of highly publicized tragedies, real, verifiable, and deeply human, had been stretched by repetition into something mythic, and it is here, in the shadow where fact and fear tangled themselves together, that the most infamous PCP cases in American history took their final shape, beginning with violent altercations that police records still preserve in blunt, unromantic language. Individuals found wandering into traffic without hesitation, suspects fighting officers with blank detachment rather than rage, domestic disturbances that escalated not from malice, but from total misalignment between thought and consequence, and shootings that occurred not because people were invincible, as headlines later suggested, but because they failed to register warnings, commands, or sometimes even the presence of the weapon itself, advancing or struggling in states of dissociation where pain, logic, and fear had been chemically muted. Emergency room archives from the 1970s and 80s record devastating self-inflicted injuries that were not acts of despair, but accidents born from altered perception. People climbing rooftops believing they could glide, individuals striking walls at full speed under hallucinations of erased distance, users sustaining catastrophic burns because the sensation of heat arrived only after the damage was already done. And in each of these cases, the story later told to the public was distilled into a single frightening image, stripped of context, stripped of neurochemistry, stripped of the ordinary human confusion that unfolded underneath. Some of the most notorious incidents, replayed endlessly by television and tabloid press, became foundational bricks in the mythology of angel dust. Videos of suspects restrained by multiple officers, newspaper photos of bodies on asphalt framed by words like rampage and uncontrollable, stories of people surviving injuries that should have stopped them sooner, and with each retelling the details sharpened into something unnatural. Strength became superhuman, resistance became bulletproof, confusion hardened into demonic rage, and before long PCP was no longer described as a dissociative drug, but as a possession state that rewrote the rules of flesh itself. Yet when toxicology reports, autopsy findings and witness statements are laid side by side without theatrical lighting, a more uncomfortable truth emerges. These individuals were not impervious. They were highly vulnerable. Many did not lack pain. They lacked interpretation. Many did not seek violence. They They lack the internal alarm that normally prevents it. And many died not because PCP made them monsters, but because it made them dangerously unaware of what their bodies were actually enduring. Nowhere was distortion more extreme than in the infamous cannibalism rumours and the recurring legend of people supposedly lifting cars under the influence. Stories that circulated so freely they hardened into urban scripture despite the absence of credible forensic proof tying such acts directly and exclusively to PCP. In reality, detailed investigations into these claims repeatedly revealed combinations of severe mental illness, polysubstance intoxication, traumatic brain injury, or outright fabrication layered onto isolated incidents. Yet once those stories crossed into racialized media narratives, especially in the coverage of inner-city crime, they took on a life of their own, circulating as warnings that quietly encoded fear of entire neighborhoods, entire demographics, entire communities already burdened by aggressive policing and systemic neglect. PCP became not just a drug but a symbolic threat, a chemical excuse that allowed complex human tragedies to be flattened into sensational shorthand, and in that flattening nuance vanished completely. What remains when the mythology is peeled away is a record of lives intersecting with a molecule they did not fully understand. People who jumped believing gravity had paused. People who fought because confusion had erased the difference between defense and attack. People who died because their nervous systems could not warn them in time. And alongside them, officers who arrived already primed by media fears, doctors forced to sedate patients they barely recognized as conscious, and families left trying to reconcile the person they knew with the stranger described in police reports and headlines. These cases shaped how America learned to fear angel dust, but they also reveal how easily fear itself becomes a co-author of history, bending each event toward the most terrifying interpretation available, and in that distortion, the drug's true legacy was quietly rewritten, not as a neurological disruptor that dismantled perception, but as a cultural monster onto which society projected its anxieties, prejudices, and hunger for explanation without complexity, leaving behind a body of infamous stories that tell us as much about the chemistry of panic as they ever did about the chemistry of PCP itself. By the time angel dust finished carving its reputation into police reports and hospital corridors, it had also begun to etch itself into the language, rhythms, and survival codes of the streets, slipping quietly into Black and Latino neighborhoods in the late 70s and early 80s not as an abstract chemical, but as a lived presence that reshaped nights, music, and memory. And it was there, in the raw creative pressure of urban life, that PCP found its most enduring cultural shadow, because long before journalists tried to explain it, and long before politicians tried to erase it with laws, rappers and street poets had already named it in passing, weaving water, sherm, and dippers into verses not as celebration but as observation, as markers of a reality that surrounded them, a reality where people drifted in and out of dissociation on stoops and dance floors, where the drug was not a headline but a neighbour you learned to recognise by posture, by the strange empty focus in the eyes, by the sudden stillness that could break into chaos without warning. In Washington, D.C., the city that had already become the unofficial capital of PCP, go-go clubs turned into some of the most intense collision points between music, motion, and dissociation, because go-go was built on relentless rhythm, physical endurance, sweat, and community energy. And angel dust moved through that environment like an invisible fault line, some dancers becoming unmoored from their bodies as the percussion drove faster and louder, others standing frozen while the room pulsed around them, partners suddenly unrecognizable as their reactions slipped off the expected emotional track, and outside those clubs in the streets that fed them, Love Boat circulated with casual familiarity, not as a glamorous escape but as a dangerous constant, a wild card that everyone knew could flip a night without warning. What separated PCP from the other drugs already present in these communities was not just intensity but unpredictability, because heroin made you sink, cocaine made you chase, alcohol made you sway, but angel dust made you disappear into your own nervous system. And that disappearance carried consequences that echoed outward into families and blocks long after the immediate high had faded. Parents learned to listen for footsteps that sounded wrong on the stairs. Partners learned to recognize the moment when conversations stopped connecting. Neighbors learned to step back when a familiar face suddenly moved with unfamiliar absence. And children learned too early what it meant when adults said someone was on water tonight, a phrase that carried less humor than dread. Emergency sirens became part of the soundscape not just for overdoses, but for collisions between bodies and the unfiltered physics of the world. Falls, crashes, fights that started without anger and ended without memory. And with each incident, trauma layered itself into communities already carrying more weight than they could afford. In music, the references did not arrive as anthems of praise, but as fragments of warning, coded acknowledgements that a certain cigarette meant a sudden break from reason, that a certain look meant tonight might not follow normal rules, and these mentions travelled far beyond the neighbourhoods that birthed them, leaking into national culture stripped of context, turning lived experience into slang consumed by people who did not have to share the consequences. And in that translation, something essential was lost. The fear underneath the words, the funerals behind the metaphors, the nights when entire families waited for someone who did not come home the same. What the broader culture often missed was that PCP did not arrive in these neighbourhoods as a novelty, but as a pressure multiplier, intensifying the instability already created by unemployment, underfunded schools, aggressive policing, and the steady erosion of public mental health care. And instead of being treated as a medical disaster layered onto social disaster, it was framed as a cultural flaw, a dangerous stereotype that reduced complex communities to simplified images of chaos and aggression. This misframing deepened the damage, because when a drug becomes associated not just with harm but with identity, the response shifts from care to containment, from treatment to punishment, and the people most affected by PCP found themselves fighting on multiple fronts at once, against the chemical effects of the drug, against the trauma it left behind, and against the way the outside world chose to see them through the lens of fear it had amplified. And yet, within that pressure, culture continued to do what it has always done in the face of damage. It recorded, it translated, it warned, it remembered. The mentions of Sherm and water that echoed through early hip-hop were not advertisements, but timestamps carved into sound. Proof that a generation had lived beside a chemical that unstitched reality, and had learned, through rhythm and language, to mark the danger without glorifying it. This is the part of the story that never fit cleanly into courtroom transcripts or medical journals, because its evidence lives in music, in memory, in neighbourhoods that learned to navigate a drug that did not simply intoxicate but destabilized. And in that navigation, the scars left by angel dust became not just personal but cultural, woven quietly into the background of an era that carried far more weight than most outside observers ever understood. By the early 80s, the chemical storm that PCP had unleashed across America finally began to lose momentum, not because public understanding had improved, or because law enforcement had learned to control it, but because a new substance, faster, cheaper, sharper, and infinitely more addictive, swept into the streets like a tidal wave and rewrote the economics of urban drug culture overnight. And that substance was crack cocaine, the crystallized form of a stimulant that promised not dissociation but velocity, euphoria, immediacy, the feeling of being launched into the world rather than peeled away from it. And once crack arrived, it did not compete with angel dust. It obliterated its market, because where PCP produced confusion, unpredictability, and police attention that dealers hated, crack produced volume, profit, and a customer base designed to return again and again in frantic desperation. And in a matter of months, the maps of drug distribution that once pulsed with the slow, erratic rhythms of water dens transformed into hyper-efficient crack networks operating in alleys, abandoned row houses, and open-air markets that stayed active until sunrise. Angel dust, once infamous enough to dominate headlines and terrify entire cities, suddenly became an afterthought, a leftover from a different era, a chemical ghost haunting the corners of communities now consumed by the immediate devastation of crack addiction. Dealers who had once dipped cigarettes into liquid PCP by the hundreds now switched products almost overnight, trading the messy volatility of homemade dissociatives for the razor-sharp efficiency of crack vials and rock houses. And the street-level entrepreneurs who once feared the unpredictable behaviour of PCP customers now preferred the predictable hunger of stimulant dependency. Even the language of the streets shifted. The slang for Sherm, Love Boat, and dippers grew quieter, drowned out by the new vocabulary of crack, rocks, bass, hits, pipes, and the relentless drumbeat of sales that could generate more profit in an hour than PCP could in a week. Media attention, always hungry for the newest catastrophe, pivoted with ruthless decisiveness. Newspapers that once printed dramatic front-page stories about PCP madness abandoned the narrative almost instantly in favour of the crack epidemic, a crisis that offered more dramatic visuals, more political capital, more national panic. Angel dust became yesterday's nightmare, overshadowed by a new monster that clawed through American cities with horrifying speed. Television specials that once warned of superhuman PCP users now aired footage of crack houses in ruins, families splintered by addiction, and neighbourhoods transformed into open-air battlegrounds almost overnight. The mythology of angel dust faded. Not corrected, not replaced by truth, simply pushed into the shadows by a new wave of sensationalism that required no memory of what came before. Hospitals, which had once braced themselves nightly for the unpredictable chaos of PCP emergencies, reported a stark decline in dissociative crises. The characteristic cases, patients who walked through glass without bleeding, who spoke to voices only they could hear, who believed themselves weightless or invincible, became less frequent, replaced by stimulant overdoses, heart attacks, violent fights fueled by paranoia, and the grinding exhaustion of chronic crack use. ER doctors almost felt a strange sense of relief, not because crack was any less destructive. If anything, it devastated communities more thoroughly. But because PCP had carried an unpredictability that terrifies medical staff more than addiction ever could, angel dust users were neurological wildcards, people whose brains had been chemically unthreaded. Crack users, though tragic, behaved in ways medicine already knew how to anticipate. For a brief window, perhaps the only quiet moment in the drug's entire American history, PCP became a fading rumour, a background hum rather than a siren. Police training manuals stopped adding new warnings. Politicians stopped invoking it in speeches. The public, now fixated on televised crack raids and the rhetoric of the war on drugs, forgot that angel dust had once been the most feared chemical in the nation. And in that moment of distraction, PCP did what it always did. It waited. Unlike crack, its profit margins remained high. Unlike heroin, it required no international trafficking routes. Unlike cocaine, it could be synthesized in a garage with glassware and nerve. PCP did not die in the 80s. It simply stepped out of the spotlight while a louder, deadlier epidemic burned across the country. And in that brief silence, as America lost itself in the chaos of crack cocaine, angel dust settled into a dormant phase, not gone, not defeated, merely overshadowed, preparing for the moment when the chaos of the streets would once again leave room for a drug that specialized not in speed or pleasure, but in breaking the connection between the human mind and the world it believes it inhabits. Just when the country believed angel dust had finally been buried beneath the louder wreckage of the crack era, it began to seep back into the bloodstream of the streets in the early 1990s with the patience of something that never truly leaves, resurfacing quietly at first in south-central Los Angeles, in pockets of Philadelphia, in Newark, in neighborhoods where abandonment had become normal, and memory traveled faster than official warnings. And this time the drug returned wearing a new disguise traded under the name Sherm Sticks. Cigarettes dipped not in mystery, but in something even more unsettling to the imagination. Embalming fluid. Though in most cases the fluid was nothing more than liquid PCP itself wrapped in a more macabre myth that only added to its aura of danger. On street corners and in abandoned row houses, thin white cigarettes soaked and dried with chemical sheen began circulating like quiet signals that a familiar instability had come back for another season. Passed hand to hand at underground parties where bass rattled through cracked walls, at gang gatherings where reputation already flirted with risk, in low-income neighborhoods where escape, no matter how temporary or destructive, still held currency. This new wave did not arrive with the chaotic curiosity of the 70s, but with the hardened pragmatism of a generation that had already watched crack burn its way through families and blocks. And yet the same old unpredictability followed it like a shadow, because PCP did not adapt to culture as much as culture adapted to its damage. Users drifting into dissociation mid-conversation, dancers freezing in place while music thundered around them, sudden eruptions of aggression that seemed to come not from anger, but from pure neurological misfire. And once again, emergency rooms began seeing bodies that defied ordinary logic. People with shattered fingers they continued to bend without flinching. People who ran headlong into fences and concrete barriers as if depth itself had been erased. People who collapsed into catatonic silence, with eyes open and lungs breathing while their minds wandered completely elsewhere. Gang culture absorbed the drug not as a ritual of unity, but as an amplifier of volatility, because where PCP entered already tense environments, it multiplied every risk. Confrontations escalated without warning, disputes became sudden explosions, and loyalty dissolved into confusion just as easily as fear did. And law enforcement, now staffed by a new generation of officers who had heard the legends but never faced the chemical reality, found themselves confronting the same patterns their predecessors had warned about decades earlier. Suspects who did not respond to pain, arrests that turned into exhausting physical struggles, individuals who seemed to fight not with rage but with absence, as if the person inside the body had stepped aside and left only reflex behind. Training bulletins quietly resurrected the old warnings. Backup calls multiplied. Restraint protocols were rewritten again, as if time itself had looped back to a lesson nobody had fully learned the first time. In these neighbourhoods, the return of PCP carried a strange generational echo. Older residents recognised the symptoms immediately and felt an old dread resurface in their chests, while younger users encountered the drug not as history, but as raw personal experience, learning its dangers not from textbooks but from watching friends wander into traffic, collapse on dance floors, or vanish into psychiatric wards without remembering how they got there. Families once again learned to read the subtle signs of dissociation, the vacant stare, the slow, delayed responses, the sudden disconnection from pain, and children once again learned the uneasy vocabulary that adults used when they didn't want to explain everything out loud. What made the 90s resurgence especially haunting was its silence. Unlike the first explosion, it did not immediately trigger national panic or breathless news coverage. It moved through communities quietly, beneath the radar of a media cycle now saturated with other crises, and because the drug was no longer new, its victims no longer surprised the system. Hospitals stabilized them, police restrained them, neighborhood elders warned about them, and the culture adjusted around the danger with the weary familiarity of something it had already survived once. PCP did not return as a headline. It returned as a condition, a recurring fault line running through places where infrastructure, opportunity, and trust had already been eroded. And in that quiet recurrence, a chilling truth settled into place. Angel dust did not spread only because of chemistry or profit or policing failures, but because the conditions that once allowed it to flourish had never truly been healed. The same fractures in community support, mental health care, economic stability, and social safety were still wide enough for the molecule to slip through, bringing with it the same dissociation, the same trauma, the same pattern of unpredictable violence that police had warned about 20 years earlier. The 90s resurgence was not a revival. It was a reminder, proof that once a chemical learns how to survive inside a society's deepest cracks, it does not need to shout to return. It only needs to wait. By the time the new century settled into its uneasy rhythm of smartphones, surveillance cameras, and 24-hour news cycles, angel dust no longer dominated headlines or political speeches, no longer frightened suburban living rooms the way it once had. Yet beneath that surface disappearance, it remained deeply rooted in specific urban veins, stubborn as a chronic infection. And in cities like Philadelphia, Washington, and parts of the Northeast and West Coast, emergency rooms quietly kept the same old statistics alive, year after year listing PCP among the top substances involved in violent or psychotic medical emergencies, not as a historical artifact but as a present-tense threat, a drug that refused to exit the stage even when newer epidemics crowded it out of public attention. On intake forms, the patterns remained eerily familiar to doctors who had studied decades-old case files. Confusion so total that patients could not state their own names, dissociation so deep that limbs seemed to move without ownership, pain insensitivity so extreme that people arrived with fractures, burns, and internal injuries they did not perceive, and behaviour so unpredictable that even seasoned trauma staff learned to approach every PCP case as a live wire rather than a routine overdose, because the first minutes could unfold in total stillness and the next in explosive agitation without warning. In modern case reports, the scenes look almost unchanged from the 70s and 90s despite the passage of time. Individuals wandering into traffic with vacant precision, calm expressions masking neurological chaos. Users collapsing into rigid postures on sidewalks while their lungs continued to breathe steadily, as if autonomy itself had been temporarily outsourced. People restrained not because of intent to harm, but because their nervous systems had stopped cooperating with the basic rules of environmental awareness. Paramedics described the same hollow-eyed stares, the same delayed responses to verbal commands, the same terrifying inability to assess danger that once filled entire training manuals decades earlier, and officers still encounter suspects who ignore pain signals entirely, not out of strength, but out of neurological silence, advancing or resisting through injury with no internal alarm to interrupt the motion. What changed in the 21st century was not the effect of the drug, but the context in which it operated. PCP no longer swept entire cities as a wave. Instead, it lodged itself into tightly bound networks of users and suppliers, circulating through familiar routes of underground parties, abandoned properties, and street-level economies that existed parallel to the digitized world above them. Social media captured fragments of episodes in shaky vertical video, people frozen mid-street, bodies moving erratically, police struggling to immobilize someone who seemed absent from their own skin, clips that briefly went viral before disappearing under the next scrolling avalanche, turning real neurological collapse into fleeting entertainment without consequence or explanation. The drug's mythology mutated again, detached from its pharmacology and reduced to shock content, while the medical reality continued unfolding in the same emergency rooms it had haunted for half a century. Philadelphia hospitals in particular began noting that PCP had achieved a strange endurance, unmatched by many other street drugs, not because of mass popularity, but because of its consistency. New opioids rose and fell, synthetic stimulants rotated through neighborhoods at the speed of legislation, but PCP maintained a steady, low-burning presence that never vanished completely, producing a constant background of dissociative crises that strained psychiatric wards and trauma units alike. Modern toxicology rarely found PCP alone. It arrived layered with alcohol, benzodiazepines, opioids, and synthetic compounds, creating unpredictable chemical storms inside already fragmented nervous systems, and each combination made rescue more difficult, sedation more dangerous, outcomes harder to predict. For communities still affected by wet, as the dipped cigarette continued to be known, the damage unfolded not in newspaper spikes but in generational echoes. Parents who remembered its first wave now watching it circle their neighborhoods again in quieter form, siblings navigating relationships with users who vanished mentally without leaving physically, children learning yet another version of the same old warning language tailored to a world that preferred not to remember. And despite everything we now understand about neurotransmitters, receptors, dissociation, and long-term psychiatric injury, despite decades of research and forensic clarity, the lived experience of PCP in these communities remains strikingly unchanged. Nights that fracture without warning, bodies that become strangers to themselves, fear that does not announce itself with speed but with absence. In this modern phase, angel dust no longer needed the spotlight to survive. It required only the cracks that never closed, the gaps in care that never healed, the small underground markets that never truly disappeared. And so, while the nation debates new crises, new substances, new moral panics, PCP continues its quiet work in the background, repeating the same neurological script it has performed since the operating rooms of the 1950s. Disconnection without anesthesia, hallucination without insight, survival without awareness. A chemical reminder that some epidemics do not burn out in spectacular fashion, but linger in the shadows, unchanged, waiting for the next body to lose its way inside itself. Long after the streets had learned to fear angel dust and long after hospitals had erased its name from surgical charts, the molecule returned once again to the world it had been exiled from, not as a medicine, not as a menace, but as a scientific instrument, because in the quiet corridors of neuroscience labs the same chemical that once shattered lives began to reveal something far more unsettling than any headline. PCP did not merely imitate madness, it mapped it with uncanny precision, and as researchers searched for ways to understand schizophrenia, dissociation, and the architecture of psychosis itself, they discovered that no compound reproduced these states with such brutal fidelity, no simulation so accurately fractured perception, memory, emotion, and self. As this one forgotten anesthetic and so under controlled conditions, in sterilized rooms far removed from sirens and alleyways, phencyclidane was once again administered not to escape reality but to understand how it breaks. Scientists watched as the familiar pattern unfolded, NMDA receptors falling silent, glutamate transmission collapsing into static, cortical networks losing their synchronized rhythm, and in brain scans and behavioral models, they saw the same signatures that haunted psychiatric wards across the world: disorganized thinking, sensory distortion, emotional blunting, paranoia without narrative, fear without object. For the first time, psychosis was no longer only a collection of symptoms described by suffering patients, but a living electrical event that could be triggered, paused, observed, and studied in real time. And the implications were staggering, because what PCP offered was not just a model of illness, but a window into the most fragile machinery of consciousness itself, the circuitry that normally binds thought to perception, intention to motion, memory to identity. And once those bindings were chemically loosened, the mind revealed how close it always sits to fragmentation. Researchers used PCP to probe the deepest questions psychiatry had wrestled with for more than a century. Where does the sense of self emerge? How does the brain decide what is real? Why does meaning disintegrate when certain synaptic gates fall silent? And what invisible synchrony keeps the inner world stitched together from second to second? In animal models, the drug produced eerily precise replications of human psychotic behavior: social withdrawal, exaggerated startle responses, disrupted learning, cognitive inflexibility. And in this controlled collapse of cognition, scientists began testing new classes of antipsychotic medications, using PCP-induced symptoms as a proving ground for compounds that might one day stabilize the very networks PCP had taught them how to break. In this way, the chemistry of destruction became the chemistry of illumination, and the same molecule that once turned city blocks into unstable theatres of dissociation now guided researchers toward possible paths of repair. The irony was impossible to miss and impossible to escape. The drug that medicine had rejected for being too dangerous to control became one of its most precise tools for studying the most dangerous disorders of the mind. PCP was no longer seen only as a street poison, but as a key to understanding glutamatergic signaling, thalamocortical loops, and the fragile choreography that allows billions of neurons to produce something as seamless as a single coherent thought. And yet, even as it was dissected in peer-reviewed journals and encoded in neurochemical diagrams, its shadow never fully lifted from the research, because every discovery carried with it the memory of what had happened when these mechanisms were unleashed without limits, when receptors were blocked not in milligrams and microseconds, but in chaos and neglect. In this strange afterlife of scientific redemption, phencyclidine became both a warning and a guide, proof that the line between cure and catastrophe can be as thin as a molecular bond, and that understanding madness sometimes requires walking close enough to its edge to feel the gravity pull back. The operating rooms that once celebrated the drug would never accept it again, but the laboratories that now studied it did so with a different kind of reverence, one shaped not by faith in miracles, but by the sobering knowledge that inside this rejected compound lived one of the clearest maps humanity had ever drawn of how reality itself can come apart inside the human brain. By the time angel dust had travelled through headlines, police footage, courtroom testimony, and street legend, the myth had grown so large that it almost completely eclipsed the molecule itself. And in that distortion, the public learned to fear not what PCP actually did to the human brain, but what movies, tabloids, and rumour insisted it could do. And so it became necessary, long overdue, uncomfortable, and deeply unfashionable, to separate the spectacle from the science, to strip away the exaggerated narratives that painted users as monsters, and return to the colder, more unsettling truth of neurochemistry. Because PCP does not grant superhuman strength. It does not rewrite muscle fibers or reinforce bones. It does not inject power into the body like some illicit serum. What it does is erase the internal governor that normally tells the brain when the body is in danger, when pain should interrupt motion, when fear should enforce retreat, and without those breaks, people do not become stronger. They simply become reckless beyond instinct, continuing to move forward through injury they cannot properly interpret, and to outside observers that persistence looks like strength, when in reality it is neurological blindness. PCP does not turn people into cannibals, despite the sensational stories stitched together from isolated incidents, misreported toxicology, and sensationalized violence layered with racial fear. There is no pharmacological pathway by which this molecule induces predatory feeding behavior, and when such horrors have occurred in the real world, they have almost always involved extreme polysubstance intoxication, untreated psychotic illness, or outright fabrication reshaped into folklore by media repetition. PCP does not make people immune to bullets either. No chemical in existence can cancel the physics of penetration, hemorrhage, and organ failure. Yet the myth persisted because people under dissociation sometimes failed to register being shot immediately, sometimes continued to move until shock or blood loss overtook them, and those delayed collapses were misread as invincibility rather than as tragic lag between injury and perception. What PCP actually does is at once simpler and far more disturbing than the myths suggest. It detaches sensation from consequence, agreement from awareness, perception from physical reality. It dissolves the warning system that normally translates damage into meaning, and in that absence the body becomes a vehicle without a functioning dashboard, moving, colliding, fracturing without reliable feedback. It distorts space so that distances miscalculate themselves. It distorts time so that seconds stretch or vanish entirely. It distorts identity so that people speak and act as if observing themselves from elsewhere. And inside that distortion, psychosis does not arrive as theatrical madness, but as a quiet misalignment where logic unthreads one assumption at a time. Hollywood invented monsters because monsters are easier to sell than neurochemical collapse, and propaganda preferred superhuman villains because it justified force better than vulnerability ever could. But science paints a far less cinematic portrait. PCP users are not transformed into something more than human. They are temporarily robbed of the systems that keep them safely human, stripped of pain as guidance, stripped of fear as compass, stripped of continuity as anchor, and when that scaffold disappears, behavior turns chaotic not because of power, but because of disorientation. In this gap between what the drug truly does and what the culture insists it does, the greatest damage of all quietly unfolds, because a society that believes it is confronting monsters stops looking for patience, and a system that prepares only for brute force forgets how to respond to neurological crisis. And so the myth survives not because it is accurate, but because it is convenient. Convenient for fear, convenient for spectacle, and devastating for anyone whose brain once slipped into that dissociated silence where reality itself loses the right to feel trustworthy. In the end, when the noise fades and the headlines rot into archives, the true biography of PCP reveals itself not as a simple rise and fall story, but as a long, uneasy migration through every layer of American life. Because it was born not in alleyways but in operating rooms under sterile light, praised at first as a medical miracle that could silence pain without silencing breath, welcomed as a triumph of modern chemistry that promised surgeons god-like control over suffering, and then just as quietly cast out when its shadow surfaced in recovery rooms, where patients returned wrong, detached, frightened, broken in ways no scalpel could fix. It died on paper as a medicine, and was reborn in practice as a street drug, stripped of its scientific name and baptized with mythology, inflated by rumour into a monster that headlines loved more than truth, hunted by police who feared what they were told it created, studied by scientists who later realised it revealed more about the fractures of the human mind than almost any compound ever discovered, and misunderstood by nearly everyone at every stage of its existence. Because doctors saw only its danger, dealers saw only profit, users saw only escape, media saw only spectacle, and politics saw only a villain worthy of war. What PCP truly did was never as cinematic as the legends that surrounded it, and far more disturbing for that very reason, because it did not grant power, it removed anchors, it did not create monsters, it disconnected warning systems, it did not turn people into something more than human. It quietly stripped away the neurochemical agreements that normally keep a person safely inside their own body, inside their own fear, inside their own limits. It moved through laboratories, through counterculture, through burned-out neighbourhoods, through gang economies, through emergency rooms and psychiatric wards, through music and memory and misinformation, leaving behind not a single type of victim, but a long trail of disconnected moments where minds slipped loose from bodies and returned altered or not at all. And in that long passage, America did not merely fail to control PCP, it failed to understand it, choosing easier stories over harder truths, choosing monsters over medicine, choosing fear over coherence. The molecule that once promised painless surgery became something far more enduring and far more uncomfortable. A warning written in neurochemistry that not every scientific breakthrough belongs in human hands, that not every key should be used to unlock the deepest doors of perception, and that when a society mistakes disconnection for power and spectacle for reality, The most dangerous monsters it creates are not chemical at all, but the stories it chooses to believe about them.